They thought I was just a quiet data analyst. Nothing special. Daniel Chen, 34 years old, wearing the same rotation of button-down shirts to the same cubicle for the past 6 years. Head down, doing good work without making waves. The kind of employee who shows up early, stays late when needed, and never causes HR headaches. But when my manager leaned in and said in Mandarin, "We'll fire him right after he finishes training the new guy," I knew it was time to remind them who I really was. Let me back up. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. This one starts quiet but hits hard by the end. You'll want to see how it unfolds. I worked at TechFlow Solutions, a Seattle software firm focused on healthcare data analytics. Not glamorous, but steady, with enough pay for a good apartment and the occasional trip. I'd been there since finishing my computer science degree at the University of Washington, moving from junior analyst to senior data specialist. The company was growing fast, which made what happened next all the stranger. One Tuesday, my manager Brian Walsh called me into his office. Brian was classic middle management, good at talking to execs, clueless about the technical side. "Daniel, I've got a special project," he said. "We're bringing in a new hire, Stanford guy, strong machine learning background. CEO thinks he's a future star. I want you to train him," I agreed. It was part of my role, though rare to be singled out by the C-suite. The kid, Alex Morrison, started Monday. He was sharp, quick with questions, and handled our systems faster than most. Confident, but not arrogant. On his second day, I showed him one of our major client pipelines. "This documentation is incredible," he said, impressed. I'd spent years refining those systems. "Took a while, but centralizing knowledge saves everyone time," I explained. "How long have you been on this client?" he asked. 4 years, one of our biggest contracts. "And you built most of this?" "The core architecture, yeah," I said. The foundation was mine, even if others had added pieces since. For 3 weeks, I walked Alex through everything: client systems, workflows, disaster recovery. He absorbed it all quickly, asking sharp questions, and by the end of the month, he was handling client requests on his own. That's when the changes started. My access to shared folders vanished under temporary maintenance. Meetings I'd always attended went on without me, streamlined to essential staff. My performance review kept getting delayed. Subtle things, but all while I was training the guy who could replace me. I noticed Brian meeting privately with the CEO and Alex being invited to sessions I wasn't. People grew polite in that careful, distant way you use around someone whose days are numbered. The confirmation came one Thursday. After finishing a flawless training session with Alex, I stayed back to clean up. Moments later, Brian, the CEO Robert Kim, and Alex walked in, assuming the room was empty. "Daniel?" "Thought you'd left," Brian said. "Just cleaning up," I replied. Robert thanked me for training Alex, then, as I turned to go, switched into rapid Mandarin. "Now we can move forward with the plan." Brian answered in halting Mandarin. "Good. The transition should be smooth, Robert. The kid's ready. Better than I expected. Stanford delivers Brian. Much better than keeping the old guy. Costs half as much, has modern skills." Robert chuckled. "Perfect. Fire the dinosaur right after he finishes training his replacement. Saves us 2 salaries. My hand froze on the door handle. They thought I couldn't understand. They were wrong. More laughter from both of them. The cruel kind that comes from people who think they're smarter than everyone around them. Alex's voice, also in Mandarin but hesitant. "Are you sure this is the right approach? Daniel seems like a valuable employee." "Valuable employees don't cost what he costs," Robert replied dismissively. "You're the future, Alex. He's just legacy code we're finally getting around to replacing." Brian added, "Besides, he'll never see it coming. Guys like Daniel never do. They think loyalty and hard work matter." "They used to," Robert said. "But this is business. We keep who we need, and we eliminate redundancies." I stood frozen by the door, my hand still on the handle, processing what I'd just heard. Not only were they planning to fire me immediately after I finished training Alex, but they were discussing it like I was some kind of outdated equipment to be discarded. The conversation was continuing, but I forced myself to open the door and walk out calmly. In the hallway, I nodded politely to Brian's assistant and made my way back to my desk, my mind racing. They thought they were having a private conversation. They assumed I was just another monolingual American who wouldn't understand their plotting. They had no idea that I'd spent my junior and senior years of high school in Shanghai, where my father had been stationed with his engineering firm. They didn't know that I'd lived with a Chinese host family, attended a local international school, and become fluent enough in Mandarin to dream in the language by the time I returned to Seattle for college. They thought I was invisible. They thought I was just quiet. They were about to learn the difference. The rest of that Thursday was an exercise in self-control. I sat at my desk, responding to emails and running data reports, while internally processing the full implications of what I'd overheard. Every interaction with Brian felt surreal. His friendly questions about Alex's progress, his casual mentions of upcoming projects, all while knowing he was planning to eliminate my position in 8 days. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about me. This was about a pattern of behavior that revealed something ugly about TechFlow's leadership. How many other loyal employees had been pushed out after training their replacements? How many other people had been discussed like expendable assets in languages they weren't expected to understand? That evening, I drove to a coffee shop across town and spent 3 hours reviewing everything I knew about my employment contract, company policies, and Washington state labor laws. I also did something I hadn't done in years. I called my old Mandarin tutor from college. "Daniel." "What a surprise," said Professor Lee, my former Chinese literature instructor at UW. "It's been, what, 10 years?" "Something like that." "Professor, I hope you don't mind me calling out of the blue, but I have a question about Mandarin translation and legal documentation." "Of course, what can I help you with?" I explained the situation in general terms, asking about the precision of legal terminology in Mandarin and whether recorded conversations would maintain their meaning when translated for official purposes. Professor Lee was intrigued by the academic challenge and spent 20 minutes helping me understand the nuances of the specific phrases I'd heard. The expression Robert used, "eliminate redundancies," that's very precise business language in Mandarin, she explained. It's not casual conversation. It's the kind of formal terminology you'd use in executive planning sessions. And the phrase about legacy code? That's particularly damning in a business context. It suggests systematic devaluation based on age or tenure rather than performance. Very problematic from an employment law perspective. Friday morning, I arrived at work early and began documenting everything, not just the overheard conversation, but the pattern of behavior leading up to it. The revoked access privileges, the excluded meetings, the delayed performance review. I compiled emails, screenshots, and timestamps that painted a clear picture of a planned termination disguised as routine management decisions. I also began making copies of documentation I'd created over the years: training manuals, system architectures, client protocols, intellectual property that I'd developed, and that would be crucial for whoever took over my responsibilities. Under my employment contract, any work I'd done using company resources belonged to TechFlow, but the contract also included specific provisions about knowledge transfer and training obligations. Most importantly, I started recording conversations. Washington is a two-party consent state for recording, which meant I couldn't legally record conversations without permission from all parties. But I could document the substance of conversations immediately after they occurred, and I could request written confirmation of verbal instructions. The opportunity for the latter came that afternoon, when Brian asked me to stay late to prepare training materials for Alex's final week. "I want to make sure we have everything documented before you finish with him," Brian said. "You know how important it is that the transition be smooth." "Absolutely," I replied. "Should I assume Alex will be taking over my primary client accounts after the training is complete?" Brian hesitated, clearly not wanting to reveal too much too soon. "We're still finalizing the restructuring. But yes, Alex will be handling more client work going forward." "And my role in that restructuring?" Another hesitation. "We'll discuss that during your performance review." "Which is scheduled for when?" "Soon. Very soon." I spent the weekend researching employment lawyers and reviewing the documentation I'd compiled. I also reached out to Dr. Sarah Chen, a former colleague who'd left TechFlow 2 years earlier to join Meridian Analytics, one of our main competitors. "Daniel." Sarah's voice was warm when she answered my call. How are you? How are things at TechFlow? Complicated, I admitted. Sarah, can I ask you a hypothetical question about the job market? Sure. If someone with my background and experience was looking for a new position, what would you recommend? Sarah was quiet for a moment. Daniel, are you thinking about leaving TechFlow? I'm thinking about a lot of things. Well, hypothetically speaking, someone with your background would have a lot of options, especially if they spoke Mandarin. That caught my attention. Mandarin? Oh, you didn't know? Meridian just landed 3 major contracts with Chinese medical device manufacturers. We're desperately looking for senior analysts who can work directly with Mandarin-speaking clients. The pay is incredible because the skill combination is so rare. How incredible? Hypothetically, double what you're probably making now, plus equity and a signing bonus. The Chinese clients specifically requested bilingual project managers. I felt a smile spreading across my face. Hypothetically, that sounds very interesting. Daniel, if your hypothetical question isn't actually hypothetical, I could set up a very real conversation with our CEO. We've been trying to poach you for 2 years. Monday morning brought Alex's final week of training. I threw myself into the work with renewed energy, making sure he was thoroughly prepared for what was coming. Not because I felt any loyalty to TechFlow anymore, but because Alex was a decent kid who didn't deserve to fail because of his employer's scheming. You seem different today, Alex observed as we worked through a complex client troubleshooting scenario. More focused. Just want to make sure you're ready for whatever comes next. Speaking of which, Brian mentioned that there might be some organizational changes coming. Do you know anything about that? I looked at Alex carefully. He seemed genuinely concerned, not trying to fish for information or manage me toward the door. What did he tell you? Just that the team structure might be evolving. He made it sound like there would be more opportunities for growth and responsibility. I'm sure there will be. Alex frowned. Daniel, is everything okay? You've been, I don't know, different since last week. I made a decision. Alex, can I give you some advice? Sure. When organizational changes happen, make sure you understand not just your new responsibilities, but how you're expected to handle them. Don't assume that management's plans will work the way they think they will. What do you mean? I mean that replacing experienced people with talented newcomers sounds good in theory, but institutional knowledge isn't something you can transfer in a training manual. Make sure you have support systems in place. Alex nodded slowly. Are you going somewhere, Daniel? We'll see. Tuesday brought the confirmation I'd been expecting. Brian asked me to stay after our usual team meeting, ostensibly to discuss Alex's progress. How's he doing? Brian asked as the conference room emptied out. He's ready. Alex can handle the core responsibilities independently now. The advanced troubleshooting and client relationship management will take more time to master, but he has the foundation. Excellent. That brings me to something I need to discuss with you. Here it comes, I thought. The company is undergoing some structural changes, Brian continued, using the same corporate speak I'd been hearing for weeks. We're streamlining operations and reallocating resources to maximize efficiency. What does that mean for my position? Your position is being eliminated as part of the restructuring. Your last day will be Friday. I let the silence hang for a moment, watching Brian fidget with his pen. I see. And Alex will be taking over my responsibilities? Alex will be handling many of the technical functions, yes. Other responsibilities will be distributed among the team. What about my client relationships? The institutional knowledge around our major contracts? Brian waved dismissively. Everything's been documented. The transition should be smooth. And this decision was made when the executive team has been discussing restructuring options for several months. Several months, including last Thursday when you, Robert, and Alex met in conference room B? Brian's face went slightly pale. I'm not sure what you're referring to. The meeting where you discussed eliminating redundancies and getting rid of legacy code. Now Brian looked genuinely concerned. Daniel, I think there may be some misunderstanding. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice memo app I'd been using to document conversations. Would you like me to clarify the misunderstanding? I asked. Because I have very detailed notes from that conversation. Brian stared at the phone, then at me. You were eavesdropping? I was cleaning up the conference room after training Alex. You came in and assumed I'd left. Then you switched to Mandarin because you assumed I wouldn't understand. The color drained completely from Brian's face. You assumed I was just another monolingual American who couldn't follow your conversation about firing me after I finished training my replacement. Daniel, we need to involve HR. Yes, I agreed. We absolutely do. Wednesday morning, I had 3 meetings scheduled. The first was with Jessica Martinez, TechFlow's HR director. The second was with an employment attorney named David Park, whose office was conveniently located 6 blocks from TechFlow's headquarters. The third was with Robert Kim himself, a meeting I'd requested through Jessica after she'd reviewed my initial documentation. The HR meeting started exactly as I'd expected. Daniel, Brian mentioned that there might be some concerns about the restructuring process, Jessica said, her tone carefully neutral. I wanted to make sure we address any questions you might have. I appreciate that, Jessica. My primary concern is whether TechFlow's restructuring decisions are being made in compliance with Washington state employment law. Of course they are. All of our personnel decisions are reviewed for legal compliance, including decisions that are planned and discussed in foreign languages to avoid detection by affected employees. Jessica's carefully maintained composure slipped slightly. I'm not sure what you're referring to. I opened my laptop and pulled up the detailed timeline I'd prepared, complete with timestamps, email screenshots, and transcribed conversations. Last Thursday, March 24th, at approximately 4:30 p.m., Brian Walsh, Robert Kim, and Alex Morrison held a planning meeting in Conference Room B. During that meeting, they discussed in Mandarin the plan to terminate my employment immediately after I completed training Alex Morrison to take over my responsibilities. I slid a printed copy of the timeline across Jessica's desk. The conversation included specific references to eliminating legacy code, meaning me, and getting rid of the dinosaur after he finished training his replacement. They also discussed cost savings from eliminating my salary while retaining Alex at a lower rate. Jessica reviewed the timeline, her frown deepening with each page. Daniel, these are very serious allegations, but I have to point out that overhearing a conversation in a foreign language doesn't necessarily... I lived in Shanghai for 2 years during high school, I interrupted. I'm fluent in Mandarin. I understood every word of their conversation, including the business terminology they used to discuss systematic termination practices. You speak Mandarin? Fluently. Would you like me to provide you with character-by-character translations of the specific phrases they used? Jessica set down the timeline and leaned back in her chair. This is very concerning, Daniel. If what you're describing is accurate, it represents serious policy violations. It also represents potential legal violations, discrimination based on age and tenure, retaliatory practices disguised as restructuring, and conspiracy to commit wrongful termination. What are you looking for here, Daniel? Initially, I was looking for confirmation that my termination was being handled legally and ethically. Now I'm looking for accountability and appropriate remediation. Jessica nodded slowly. I think we need to involve Robert in this conversation. I agree. But first, I have a meeting with my attorney to review these materials and discuss my options under Washington state employment law. That got Jessica's full attention. Daniel, I hope we can resolve this internally before involving outside legal counsel. So do I, Jessica. But that will depend on how TechFlow chooses to handle the situation. The meeting with David Park was brief and enlightening. He reviewed my documentation, asked pointed questions about the timeline and the Mandarin conversation, and provided clarity on several legal issues I'd been researching. The foreign language aspect makes this particularly interesting, he said. Courts have consistently ruled that attempting to conceal discriminatory practices by conducting planning conversations in languages the targeted employee isn't expected to understand constitutes willful misconduct. What does that mean? Practically, it means they can't claim the termination was routine restructuring if there's evidence of deliberate concealment and planning. The fact that they specifically waited until you finished training your replacement adds another layer of problematic conduct. David also explained something I hadn't fully understood about my employment contract. The intellectual property provisions that gave TechFlow ownership of my work also included specific obligations around knowledge transfer and training documentation. If they terminate you under circumstances that suggest bad faith, and if your departure results in operational difficulties that could have been avoided through proper transition planning, they could be liable for additional damages. What kind of operational difficulties? Well, if the person you trained fails to perform adequately, and if that failure results in client dissatisfaction or contract losses, TechFlow could be held responsible for the costs of that failure. I smiled. Alex is talented, but he doesn't have the institutional knowledge to handle complex client issues independently. That knowledge takes years to develop. Exactly. And if they've eliminated the source of that knowledge in bad faith, they bear the risk of operational consequences. The afternoon meeting with Robert Kim was surreal. Jessica had clearly briefed him on our morning conversation, and he entered the conference room with the kind of controlled tension that suggested damage control mode. Daniel, I understand there may be some misunderstandings about the restructuring process, Robert began. I want to make sure we clear up any confusion. I appreciate that, Robert. Though I wouldn't characterize your conversation with Brian last Thursday as a misunderstanding. Robert's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. What conversation are you referring to? I pulled out my phone and opened the detailed notes I'd taken immediately after overhearing their planning session. The conversation where you discussed in Mandarin the plan to eliminate my position after I finished training Alex. The conversation where you referred to me as legacy code that needed to be replaced with modern alternatives? Robert stared at me for a long moment. You understood that conversation? Every word, including your comment about getting rid of the dinosaur and saving 2 salaries. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Jessica cleared her throat. Robert, we need to discuss how to handle this situation appropriately. Yes, Robert said quietly. We do. He looked at me with what might have been respect or might have been calculation. Daniel, what do you want from this conversation? Initially, I wanted to understand why my employment was being terminated despite positive performance reviews and successful completion of training assignments. Now I want to understand how TechFlow plans to address clear violations of employment law and company policy. And what would appropriate address look like to you? I'd been thinking about this question since Tuesday, and I had a clear answer. Transparency about restructuring decisions, compliance with proper termination procedures, and acknowledgement that employees shouldn't be eliminated through deceptive practices conducted in foreign languages. Robert nodded slowly. Those seem like reasonable expectations. I also think TechFlow should reconsider whether Alex is ready to handle my client responsibilities independently. The training was thorough, but institutional knowledge can't be transferred in 3 weeks. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that if you're committed to this restructuring, you ensure adequate support systems for the people who will be taking on additional responsibilities. It was a diplomatic way of saying that Alex was going to struggle without backup, and that struggle would become TechFlow's problem very quickly. I see. Robert looked at Jessica, then back at me. Daniel, would you be open to discussing alternative arrangements? Perhaps a consulting role to provide ongoing support during the transition? I think my time at TechFlow has run its course, Robert. But I appreciate the offer. That evening, I had a phone interview with Meridian Analytics. Sarah Chen had arranged for me to speak directly with their CEO, and the conversation exceeded my already high expectations. Your background is exactly what we're looking for, the CEO explained. Native-level English and business-fluent Mandarin, deep technical expertise in healthcare data analytics, and experience managing complex client relationships. Our Chinese clients have specifically requested project managers with your skill set. What would the role entail? Senior data architect, leading our international team. You'd be working directly with clients in Beijing and Shanghai, designing data integration systems for their U.S. operations. Starting salary is $180,000, plus equity, plus a $25,000 signing bonus if you can start within 2 weeks. I nearly dropped the phone. It was more than double my current salary. That sounds very interesting. What's the timeline for making a decision? We'd like to make an offer by Friday if you're interested. The Chinese clients are eager to begin the project, and having the right leadership in place is crucial. Friday morning brought my official last day at TechFlow. I arrived early to pack my personal items and complete the knowledge transfer documentation I'd been working on all week. But as I was organizing files, Alex appeared at my cubicle looking stressed. "Daniel, I need to ask you something. Can we talk privately?" We walked to an empty conference room, and Alex immediately launched into the conversation he'd clearly been rehearsing. "Brian told me yesterday that you're leaving because of restructuring, but he also said there were some complications with the transition. He made it sound like you might be upset about something." "What did he tell you specifically?" "He said you'd raised concerns about the process and that HR was involved. He warned me that you might try to sabotage the handoff or make things difficult for the team." I stared at Alex, processing Brian's attempt to preemptively undermine any concerns I might raise about the transition. "Alex, do you remember what I told you earlier this week about making sure you have adequate support systems?" "Yeah. Brian is setting you up to fail. He's eliminated the institutional knowledge you'll need to succeed, and he's trying to prevent you from accessing help by portraying me as a disgruntled employee." Alex looked confused and worried, but he said you'd been difficult to work with lately, that you were resistant to changes. "Has that been your experience with me during training?" "No, not at all. You've been incredibly thorough and supportive." That's why his comments seemed so strange. I made a decision that would complicate my clean exit, but felt necessary for Alex's success. "Here's what's actually happening," I said, and proceeded to explain the Mandarin conversation, the planned termination, and Brian's systematic deception. Alex listened with growing alarm. "They planned to fire you from the beginning? While you were training me?" "They planned to fire me as soon as you were capable of handling my responsibilities. The problem is that you're not capable of handling them yet. Not because you're not talented, but because the responsibilities require institutional knowledge that can't be transferred in a few weeks." "What kind of institutional knowledge?" I spent the next hour giving Alex a crash course in the hidden complexities of our major client relationships, the unwritten protocols, the historical context behind current systems, the personnel relationships that made difficult negotiations possible. "This is overwhelming," Alex admitted. "How am I supposed to manage all of this?" "You're not, at least not immediately. And when you struggle, which you will, through no fault of your own, Brian and Robert will blame you for not being adequately prepared." Alex rubbed his face with his hands. "What should I do?" "Document everything. When you encounter problems you can't solve, document them and the impact on client relationships. When Brian or Robert criticize your performance, remind them that the institutional knowledge needed for these situations was eliminated when they terminated me. Will you help me if I have questions?" I considered the ethics of that request. I didn't know TechFlow anything, but I didn't want to see Alex destroyed by their poor planning. "I can't provide ongoing support. That would violate my separation agreement. But if you have a genuine emergency in the first few weeks, you can reach out." At 3 p.m., I had my final meeting with Jessica Martinez to review separation documents and return company property. But instead of a routine exit interview, I found myself in a room with Jessica, Robert, and a lawyer I didn't recognize. "Daniel, before we finalize your separation, we wanted to discuss some additional terms," the lawyer began. "What kind of terms?" "Enhanced confidentiality provisions. Given the sensitive nature of some recent conversations, we'd like to ensure that proprietary information about company operations remains confidential." I almost laughed. They were trying to buy my silence about their discriminatory practices. What would these enhanced provisions include? A standard non-disparagement clause, expanded confidentiality about internal procedures, and a commitment not to discuss personnel decisions with current or former employees. And in exchange, an enhanced separation package, 6 months of continued salary, extended health benefits, and a positive reference for future employment opportunities. It was a generous offer, but it came with strings that would prevent me from discussing their misconduct with anyone who might hold them accountable. "That's very generous," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure I can agree to enhanced confidentiality provisions." Robert leaned forward. "Daniel, we value the contributions you've made to TechFlow. We want this transition to be positive for everyone involved." "I appreciate that, Robert. But I also think transparency and accountability are important values." The lawyer tried a different approach. Perhaps we could structure this as a consulting agreement rather than a separation package. You'd be available for occasional questions from the transition team, and in exchange for that availability and discretionary guidance, you'd receive the enhanced compensation. It was a clever attempt to create a business relationship that would justify the confidentiality requirements, but it would also mean ongoing entanglement with TechFlow, which was the opposite of what I wanted. I think a clean separation is better for everyone, I said. I'll stick with the standard package outlined in my employment contract. Daniel, Robert said, and I heard frustration creeping into his voice. I hope you'll reconsider. This could be beneficial for all parties involved. I'm sure it could be, Robert, but I'm comfortable with my decision. I signed the standard separation documents, returned my company laptop and access cards, and walked out of TechFlow's offices for the last time. In my car, I called Meridian Analytics and accepted their offer. My new job would start the following Monday. Same city, same industry, double the salary, and the opportunity to use skills that my former employer never knew I possessed. But the real satisfaction would come from watching the consequences of their poor planning unfold over the following weeks. The first sign that TechFlow was experiencing transition difficulties came exactly 8 days after my departure. Alex called me on a Thursday evening, his voice tight with stress. Daniel, I'm sorry to bother you, but we have a major problem with the MedSystem contract. MedSystem was TechFlow's largest client, processing medical records for over 40 hospitals across the Pacific Northwest. The contract was worth $2.3 million annually and required constant maintenance and customization. What kind of problem? Their new data integration requirements don't work with our current architecture. They need it fixed by Monday or they're considering alternative vendors. I winced. MedSystem's integration challenges were notoriously complex, requiring knowledge of both their internal systems and the regulatory requirements that governed medical data processing. It was exactly the kind of problem that required institutional knowledge rather than just technical skills. What did Brian say when you explained the situation? He told me to figure it out, said this was basic troubleshooting that any qualified data analyst should be able to handle. Alex, this isn't basic troubleshooting. MedSystem's integration requirements change based on federal regulatory updates that happen quarterly. You need to understand the historical context of their current architecture to design compatible solutions. Can you help me understand that context? I understand. You want me to continue the story from that specific point where it says, I found myself in a regular message, not updating the canvas. Here's the continuation. I found myself in an impossible position. On one hand, I genuinely cared about Alex's success and didn't want to see him destroyed by TechFlow's poor planning. On the other hand, providing detailed guidance would essentially mean doing his job remotely while TechFlow benefited from my expertise without paying for it. Alex, I can give you some general direction, but you need to understand something important. This problem exists because TechFlow eliminated institutional knowledge without proper transition planning. What do you mean? I mean that Brian and Robert made a calculated decision to fire me immediately after training you, assuming that 3 weeks of documentation would replace 6 years of client relationship management. They gambled that you could handle complex situations without the context that takes years to develop. I could hear him typing frantically as I spoke. Here's what I can tell you. MedSystem's integration requirements are tied to HIPAA compliance updates that change quarterly. The solutions we implemented were based on specific conversations with their Chief Technology Officer, Dr. Sarah Park, about their long-term regulatory strategy. Those conversations happened over years, not weeks, and most of the context was never formally documented. So I need to recreate years of relationship history in 3 days? Either that, or you need to be very clear with Brian about why that's impossible. Alex, you're being set up to fail, and when you do fail, they're going to blame your performance rather than their planning. The silence on the other end stretched for nearly a minute. Daniel, can I ask you something directly? Do you think they fired you specifically so they could hire me at a lower salary? His question was more perceptive than I'd expected. What do you think? I think they saw my Stanford degree and my machine learning background and assumed I could do everything you did, but cheaper and with more modern skills. That's a reasonable assessment. But they didn't account for institutional knowledge. Institutional knowledge can't be downloaded like software, Alex. It's built through years of client interactions, problem solving, and relationship management. After I hung up with Alex, I felt a strange mixture of sympathy and vindication. Sympathy because he was about to experience the consequences of decisions he hadn't made, and vindication because TechFlow was about to learn exactly how expensive their cost-cutting measures really were. The next call came 2 days later, this time from Brian himself. The next call came 2 days later, this time from Brian himself. His voice carried the carefully controlled panic of a manager watching his department implode in real time. Daniel, I hope you're settling into your new role well. I wanted to touch base about some client transition issues we're experiencing. What kind of issues, Brian? Well, the med system situation has become complex. Alex is working through it, but we thought you might be able to provide some quick guidance. Just a brief consultation to help smooth the transition. I almost laughed at the audacity. Brian, wasn't the whole point of eliminating my position that Alex could handle these situations independently? Of course, but every transition has bumps. We just want to ensure client satisfaction during the adjustment period. I see. And what would this consultation involve? Maybe a few hours of your time to walk Alex through the historical context of MedSystems architecture. We'd pay your standard consulting rate naturally. It was exactly what their lawyer had proposed during my exit meeting, repackaged as an emergency request. They wanted my expertise without admitting they'd made a catastrophic planning error. Brian, I'm flattered, but I'm fully committed to my new position at Meridian Analytics. They keep me quite busy with international client development. The pause that followed was telling. International clients? Yes, we specialize in data integration for Chinese medical device manufacturers entering the US market. My Mandarin fluency has been invaluable for client communication. Another long pause. You speak Mandarin? Fluently. I lived in Shanghai during high school. It's been quite an asset in my new role. The silence stretched uncomfortably. I could practically hear Brian's mental gears grinding as he processed the implications of what I just revealed. Well, he said finally, if you change your mind about consulting, I'll keep that in mind. Good luck with the med system situation. 3 weeks later, Alex called with the news I'd been expecting. They lost the contract, he said without preamble. Med system terminated it yesterday. I'm sorry to hear that. Brian blamed me for not understanding their technical requirements, said any competent analyst should have been able to handle the integration challenges. And what did you tell him? I told him exactly what you suggested, that the integration issues required institutional knowledge that was eliminated when they fired you without proper transition planning. How did he respond? He said that was an excuse and that I needed to take responsibility for my professional development. Alex's voice carried a mixture of frustration and growing understanding. Daniel, I think I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. They didn't fire you because you were inadequate. They fired you because they thought I was cheaper. What are you going to do? I'm updating my resume. This whole situation has taught me to recognize when management views employees as interchangeable spreadsheet entries rather than people with unique value. 6 months after leaving TechFlow, I received the final confirmation that their cost-saving strategy had backfired completely. Sarah Chen from Meridian called with industry news that felt like poetic justice. You're not going to believe this, she said, but TechFlow just lost 3 more major contracts. Word is spreading in the healthcare data community that their client service has completely collapsed. What happened? Same pattern as MedSystem, complex integration issues that required deep institutional knowledge, handled by people who didn't have the context to solve them properly. She paused for effect. The best part? 2 of those clients specifically asked to work with you when they signed with Meridian. They said they appreciated working with someone who understood both technical requirements and international compliance standards. International compliance? Apparently, your work with Chinese medical device manufacturers has given you expertise in cross-border data regulations that's becoming incredibly valuable. TechFlow had no idea what they were eliminating when they eliminated you. That afternoon, I reflected on the complete reversal of circumstances. TechFlow had fired me to save money and modernize their workforce. Instead, they'd lost millions in revenue, destroyed client relationships that took years to build, and created competitive advantages for their rivals. Meanwhile, I was earning double my previous salary in a role that specifically valued the combination of technical expertise and cultural knowledge that TechFlow had never bothered to discover. The irony was perfect. Robert and Brian had conducted their termination planning in Mandarin, assuming I couldn't understand their conversations about eliminating legacy code and outdated employees.